sons in many cases by the owner. And here comes Bill Belichick coming in and saying, you know what, I don't want those guys as my quarterbacks anymore.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it really related to Bernie Kosar's relationship with Art Modell and Bledsoe's relationship with Robert Kraft, though I will say Belichick was not in favor of Kraft giving $100 million to Bledsoe after Bill arrived in Foxborough. And that was one of the few times that Kraft really imposed his will on personnel decisions in the Belichick years. But Bill hadn't really been established yet. He hadn't won any championships, so it was a different dynamic there. I just think those two players, Kosar and Bledsoe, they had very good primes, and Kosar arguably a great prime, but they were physically beaten to hell at that point. And I think Bill never thought a whole lot about Bledsoe when he had to defend him as an opposing coach.
Right.
Didn't really see him as a true franchise player. And so the year that Mo Lewis of the Jets knocks out Bledsoe, I was there actually on the field that day in Foxborough. It was the first Sunday they played NFL football after 9/11, and here are the Patriots. They were 5-11 in Belichick's first year. Now they're 0-2, so they're 5-13 under Bill. They lose to the Jets at home. Drew Bledsoe, the $100 million quarterback, is knocked out, and he's going to be out indefinitely. And in trots his sixth-round pick, Tom Brady, who at the time people didn't think much of. His career at Michigan was up and down. He had to fight off Drew Henson as a starter his last 2 years at Michigan, and so people thought, hey, Belichick's going to go 5-11 again. He's going to be in danger of getting fired. I know Robert Kraft was already telling associates he was concerned. He didn't want to fire Bill after 2 years, but he had a new stadium going up, and it looked like things were going south. So he was worried about it. I know for a fact that Belichick and his staff, they were worried that he was on shaky ground there, and all of a sudden, Tom Brady starts to become arguably the greatest football player of all time as the 199th pick in the draft. Yeah, so nobody saw that coming, but they did. I will say this. Belichick did really like Brady in what he was showing in camp, in preseason, in practice, and he was looking for an opportunity to get him under center at some point. Now, he would never wish a serious injury on Drew Bledsoe, but I do know that when Brady got an opportunity to play, Belichick and much of his staff, they were not unhappy about that development.
So you don't think it was Belichick sort of like trying to plant his power, so to speak?
I don't. In that case, I just don't think he ever really was in love with Bledsoe as a player. I think when he got to Cleveland, it wasn't so much the Kosar relationship with Art Modell, though a very close one, or the Kosar relationship with the fans, because Kosar was a local boy. Mm-hmm. It was just that physically he was diminishing. And Bernie was never the greatest athlete to begin with. And so I think it was really more along those lines, and particularly when Belichick saw Brady really coming on. He was the first person in, the last person to leave, one of those kind of athletes, and he just wanted to give him an opportunity to see if he could play. They had no idea he was going to become the greatest quarterback of all time. But, in fact, there's a quote in that season in 2001 when Belichick refers to Brady and actually says something of substance when he says, hey, listen, I don't think we're talking about the next John Elway here. And as it turned out, Tom Brady ended up better than John Elway. Yeah. So, no, I think it was really more about Belichick's non-belief in Bledsoe as a franchise player and his belief that Brady was at least going to be a functioning NFL quarterback.
Ian, talk to me about just obviously, like you said already, Belichick wasn't the best coach in Cleveland. So what changed from the Cleveland Belichick to the New England Belichick? Was it just a matter of talent, or just give us some insight as far as just what led to the markedly different results? Well,
obviously Brady has so much to do with it,
right.
And I don't subtract that from Belichick's legacy. I think if you look at any great coach historically in sports, whether it's John Wooden at UCLA or Red Auerbach, they always had great players or special players as the centerpiece of their programs. And so Bill found one in the nick of time in Tom Brady. But one thing that changed stylistically was, well, he admitted in 2001 to reporters before that first Super Bowl victory over the Rams that he tried to be too much like Bill Parcells in Cleveland. And he didn't have the charisma and leadership personality to pull it off in terms of how he dealt with the media and just people in general. Mm-hmm. But I talked to a lot of Cleveland Browns for my book, players who just said, we never once felt that he cared about us as human beings, that he only saw us as football players, as athletes. And so we didn't play for him, we didn't win for him. They just didn't feel that connection with him at all. That changed in New England, at least behind the scenes. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that Bill, one-on-one in his office, really almost from the start in New England, was very good dealing with his players, making sure they understood that he did care about them as people. And Anthony Pleasant, who played with him or for him in Cleveland, with the Jets and also in New England, said in 2001, he looked at Bill and said, I want to win a championship for you because of those changes. And I can tell you that not a single Cleveland Brown ever said that to or about Bill Belichick. So he did make a change. It might not have been one seen in public, but it was there nonetheless.
Okay.
We're talking with Ian O'Connor. He is the author of Belichick, The Making of the Greatest Football Coach of All Time, available wherever you buy books. Let's talk about Bill Parcells and Belichick. These two are connected, and then at the same time, there's a lot of, it's seemingly, anger and disappointment between the two of them, I would think.
Well, they were never friends, and that might be a misnomer out there that Bill saw himself as a friend of Parcells or even a protege. He never considered Parcells a mentor. It was more that he was a boss. He did learn a decent amount from Parcells, there's no question about it, but they were never close. And Bill was rough on him during his Giants years, but Parcells was rougher on Belichick during their 3 Jets years together, which is something that's probably been underreported about their relationship. And one of the primary reasons, if not the primary reason, that Belichick left the Jets to go coach in New England, he wanted to get away from Parcells. Those 3 years with the Jets, Parcells had something to use against Belichick he didn't have in their time together with the Giants. It was Belichick's failure in Cleveland as a head coach. Parcells really weaponized that against him, and players told me that Parcells would berate him in front of them, and not just Belichick, but he was certainly he was in the line of fire quite a bit. Ray Mickens was a defensive back on that team, told me he heard Parcells berate him to a certain extent one day where he could not repeat the words that Parcells said to Belichick to me over the phone. So that wore Belichick down, and again, when Parcells was going to stay in the front office with the Jets while Belichick took over, that was something Little Bill wanted no part of. He did not want Big Bill hovering over him in that front office, and he saw in Kraft and New England a lifeline where he'd have more personnel control. He wouldn't have to deal with Parcells anymore, and that really is the reason why he left.
Well, one thing about the chapter you wrote about that, you fill in a lot of blanks that I didn't know about. I always blamed Belichick for being an opportunist, but you know what? If Parcells is screaming at you every day,
if you know you're going to hate your boss before you even start the job.
Well, I think it's both, actually, guys. To be fair, I don't want to blame the whole thing on Parcells, but he was a main factor. There's no question. Right. But I think you could still look at Belichick as an opportunist because at that press conference, he's talking about family and being on the treadmill earlier that day with Kevin Williams, who had fought through a near fatal infection in the hospital and was trying to recover. He was a defensive back and saying all these cathartic things about awakenings that he had and wanted. So he was being disingenuous at times in that press conference as well, and also talking about the ownership uncertainty after Leon Hess's death. Is it going to be Woody Johnson? Is it going to be Charles Dolan?
Right.
I think that was somewhat legitimate, that part. But the rest of it, Bill was already looking to get to New England. He had his lawyer looking into the contract and if there was a way to escape the Jets contract. And so I think a fair amount of that was disingenuous. But no question that Parcells' presence and treatment of Bill over those 3 years was a main factor, if not the main factor, in him leaving.
And of course, Parcells is the one who brought him back to New York. So,
and there are people close to Parcells who remind you that Big Bill sort of saved Little Bill after Cleveland. And I think that's a fair point to make.
Yes.
Ian, just talk about just the history. I really like the stuff that you wrote about, the high school and the college years and all that. But Belichick, with his dad, obviously seemed like he was born to be a coach, and that was something that he obviously took very seriously from, age 10, 12? I mean, it seemed like just from wherever he was or whatever age that this was the path that he was looking to take. but he was also influenced by a lot of other coaches along the way. That it seemed like he ran into a lot of kind of coach's coach kind of guys, like a lot of lifers.
Right.
How much did those guys influence him as well?
Right. Steve, being the first, and Bill, even at age 6, 7, and 8, would go with his father on scouting trips and just loved watching him work. And you could see how much his father adored the profession and breaking down games and plays and charting them and running meetings at the Naval Academy Fieldhouse on Monday nights. And yeah, but there were others. His high school coach, Al Larimore, really big on fundamentals and precision. You know, they ran at Annapolis High School like 4 or 5 plays every week, and it was like, okay, you guys know what's coming, now try to stop us. And his prep school coach at Andover, Steve Sirota, who had played with Vince Lombardi at Fordham, was a big influence. And Ted Marchibroda, I think, as well. In 1975, Marchibroda gave Bill his first job in the NFL with the Baltimore Colts and really took him under his wing and showed him the ropes, showed him what it meant to be a hard-working NFL coach. And I think Marchibroda had a profound impact on Bill. And it's interesting that one of Bill's great moments as a defensive coordinator with the Giants was at Marchibroda's expense. Marchibroda was the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills in that Gulf War Super Bowl in 1991. And Bill's defense, I wouldn't say shut down that high-flying Buffalo offense, but certainly contained it.
Slowed it down for sure.
Yeah, and that was the Jim Kelly, Thurman Thomas, Andre Reed Buffalo Bills, who had just dropped 50 points on the Raiders in the AFC Championship game. So Belichick maybe was taught too well by Marchibroda and ended up coming back and sort of haunting him in that Super Bowl. And Belichick's game plan, of course, ended up in the Hall of Fame in Canton. And I have a quote in the book from Parcells going back to our earlier discussion about Big Bill and Little Bill, where Parcells was ticked off that game plan ended up in the Hall of Fame. He said to me, you know, we only had to defend the ball 19 minutes.
Right.
If anyone's game plan should be in the Hall of Fame, it's Ron Earhart's, Ron Earhart being the offensive coordinator. So that speaks to that Parcells-Belichick relationship that we just touched on.
Right. Actually, my follow-up question I was going to ask you was how fortunate was Belichick to land his first job, not only in the NFL, but under Marchibroda with the Colts. I mean, he wasn't even being paid at first, but even though he was working for free, he really couldn't have asked for a better situation to be in as a very young guy.
Yeah, but they ended up having different styles because Marchibroda was considered one of the great gentlemen of the NFL.
Right.
And so I don't know if anyone would describe Bill in those terms. But I just think Marchibroda was very good at his job. And they would stay at a Howard Johnson's near the airport together, and they would drive in. Bill would drive in Marchibroda and a couple of other Colts coaches every day, and they would talk in the car on the way there, on the way back, and then it was 16, 18-hour days on the field and in the office. He just learned so much from a very smart and dedicated coach in Marchibroda that, and it's something Bill would talk about. I know when Marchibroda passed away, he was touched by that, and so yeah, he got fairly lucky. And even though the relationship with Parcells on a personal level didn't work out long term, he did obviously learn a lot of football from Parcells and really how to run a team. That was part of it. Ray Perkins was another positive influence on Belichick. Perkins is really the Giants coach who hired Bill back in 1979. So he did luck out with a lot of strong influences in his football life. But starting with his dad was never really a head coach. He was a head coach once in his life at Hiram College in Ohio, small school. Mm-hmm. But by being a lifer assistant and being dedicated to the scouting craft, I think Bill learned a ton from him as well.
Yes.
Well, Ian, we want to thank you for joining us. I know you have to get going. We didn't even talk about Spygate or Deflategate or whatever else. We'll save that for another time. We've been talking with Ian O'Connor, columnist for ESPN.com, and also the author of a new book called Belichick, The Making of the Greatest Football Coach of All Time. By the way, I have to tell you this, Ian, Chapter 10 about the making of, well, not the making, but the discovery of Tom Brady, fantastic chapter, because sometimes you say, well, how does someone become someone? And in that chapter, you fill in all the holes. It's not like it just popped up out of the grass. I was very impressed with that chapter. I read it twice, actually, when I first read it. So just want to let you know.
Well, thanks, guys, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about the book.
No problem. Come on anytime you want. Call us anytime. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, Ian.
We'll be back right after this, 516-572-7440. If you have a comment